Hi, I'm Simon K. Jones, and you're listening to the audio version of my newsletter. And I've got a coffee, it's pretty early in the morning, and I'm talking about my 7 pillars of world building. Okay, so when I was in the early stages of pre-production on Tales from the Triverse, I ran into a bit of a problem. The serial is structured as crime fiction, with each storyline focusing on an investigation by some detectives. Sensible crime fiction writers set their novels in the real world so that they can borrow from reality for their world building. A realist crime novel set in 2025 gets to inherit all of the audience's assumptions: physics, weather, laws, common cultural references, politics. The reader automatically knows how everything works, and the writer can build upon that solid foundation. They can push their story further from reality, of course, if they want to, nudging it into noir or pulp territory or whatever they want to do. There's tons of creative latitude even when your story is set in the real world, in quotes. It's still fiction, after all. As I started to figure out Tales from the Triverse, I realised that I'd blundered into a much more complicated scenario. The serial mixes in science fiction and fantasy, being set across 3 distinct realities: the far future, a high fantasy world, and an alternate 1970s London where the bulk of the procedural cop drama takes place. There is magic, there are spaceships and robots. The interplay and cultural collision between the 3 universes drives much of the narrative. I enjoy world building, but in previous projects it had been part of the writing process. I would build out the world as I went, other than a handful of fundamentals. The stories did not require every detail to be worked out in advance, because they were not operating within the crime fiction genre. Making it up as I went wasn't an option with Triverse, I realised. I couldn't have detectives investigating crimes if the parameters of the universes hadn't been established. That would be unfair to the readers and would result in far too much hand-wavy, make-it-up-as-I-go plot developments. When we read an Agatha Christie novel, part of the fun is trying to solve the crime before Poirot. It's a puzzle as much as it is a story, and a puzzle is only solvable if you know the rules and have all or most of the pieces. If the creator of the puzzle can, on a whim, fundamentally change how the pieces go together, it stops being fun and instead feels frustrating, like the writers cheating. I needed to define the 3 universes in the Triverse so that the rules were set and the puzzle pieces were clear. That would enable the detectives to investigate crimes and take the reader along for the ride. The problem is that the world-building process can become infinite, and I wanted to get on with actually writing the book, and that required figuring out how much world-building was required to set the rules, but without dragging me down rabbit holes that could take months from which to escape. Which brings me to the 7 pillars, which sounds very grandiose, but bear with me. So I ended up with this kind of minimum viable product approach to the whole thing. How much world building was needed for this thing to work? Look at my Scrivener project, and there are folders for each of the Triverse settings: a fantasy world folder, a sci-fi world, and a lo-fi world, as I called it. And inside each of those folders are 7 documents, named technology, economy, religion, geography, culture and society, politics, and language. My reasoning was that if I had a grounding in each of these 7 topics, I would know enough about the world to write some stories. A lot of them are kind of gross simplifications, of course, borrowing somewhat from Star Trek and Star Wars. Realistically, you can't summarise an entire planet's culture. Every country, every city, every district, every street has its own idiosyncrasies, but that's one of the necessary shortcuts I needed to take if I was ever going to actually write this thing. And besides, I knew with Palinor, for example, the fantasy setting, that I was only going to be visiting a relatively small geographic area. So to dig into each of those pillars in more detail, technology details the impact of invention on society. Is it a pre-industrial world, a primarily agrarian society perhaps, with a population dispersed across a large landmass? Or is there more advanced tech, such as factories and computers and vehicles? The level of tech has a drastic impact on how a civilization functions at all levels. How do people communicate over distance? In the case of my fantasy setting, technology means magic. So while it's a mostly pre-industrial civilization by Earth standards, it makes up for it with advanced magical capabilities. This is where I defined how the magic system worked for Palinor and how space travel works for the far future setting. Economy concerns itself with how society handles wealth and business and trade. Are we talking about villagers trading with each other on a local scale? Primarily inherited wealth moving through the genes of aristocracies? Massive solar system-wide post-capitalism? This sort of thing determines how people get food on the table and a roof over their heads. We're talking about scarcity or plenty. Religion explores the beliefs of the people. On my fantasy world, it's a made-up set of deities with the quirk that the gods are real and exist physically in the world. In my alternate 1970s Britain, it's only a step removed from the real 20th century, whereas the far future is largely secular in terms of governance and the driving factors behind society, even while legacy traditions continue quite happily in people's lives. Geography is about the land. My far future world is post-ecological collapse, with the Earth having been rewilded through a process called the greening. The fantasy world is a place of extremes, barren wastelands and deserts and towering rainforests. 1970s Britain is, as you would expect. Geography isn't just set dressing. It interacts with other elements such as technology to determine things like how easy it is for people to travel and get around, and factors into the available resources. Culture is harder to define, and I find myself having to draw with broad strokes. For Triverse specifically, it was about contrasts. The future Earth being highly progressive and permissive, 1970s Britain being nationalist and with a protectionist bent, and Palinor being a bohemian society disguising a foundation of slavery and exploitation. It all requires further exploration, which takes place in the stories, but the benefits here are how the cultures inform the characters and their responses to each other and events. Okay, I need to have a little drink of my coffee. That's good coffee. Politics does what it says on the tin. Are we talking about a 20th century style Western democracy, communist state, isolated feudal city-states, a corporate-led technocracy? What kind of freedoms and restrictions do people have when living in these places? Even if Triverse wasn't an overtly political tale, I'd still need to know about this stuff because it directly affects the behaviour of characters. Language is a practical consideration, determining whether the peoples of the different settings can even understand one another. Are there multiple languages to consider, or has a dominant language emerged? Introducing language and communication barriers can open up all sorts of interesting story possibilities, but can also be a significant complication to the storytelling. There's a reason in science fiction and fantasy that language is often skirted around. Having everyone speak a single language lets you get into the meat of the story, rather than having to always figure out communications as the first move. Star Trek's Universal Translator exists so that the writers didn't have to think about this aspect. Okay, so my theory was that the 7 categories would provide me with everything I needed to start writing the actual book. I could add details over time, of course, but the foundation would be in place from the beginning. It would keep me honest during the police investigations to the point that readers didn't feel cheated out of the solution. It helps maintain an internal consistency and keeps me from falling into plot holes. Restraints imposed by the world building lead to interesting creative solutions and ideas. What I found is that while each of the world-building pillars are fairly light on detail, they combine to create greater complexity. The nuance of a society comes alive in how these 7 elements mix. It's in that collision that a sense of verisimilitude arises. It's an approach I'll likely take forward into future projects and hopefully will prove useful for other writers. World-building is always a balance between detail and practicality. Too little in your world feels flimsy. Too much and you'll never get to the actual manuscript. All that said, this is just my way of doing it. I'd love to hear how you approach world building and how much you do prior to embarking on the story itself. And you can leave comments by heading over to the newsletter at simonkjones.substack.com. Okay, thanks for listening. You can support the newsletter over there if you feel so inclined, but otherwise I'll see you on the next one.